Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. What if I told you that every person you've ever known, every stranger you've passed on the street, every human being who has ever lived and breathed on this planet, all trace their existence back to a single moment in time when our entire species balanced on the edge of complete extinction? What if the thread connecting you to your ancestors was so thin, so fragile, that it nearly snapped entirely, leaving Earth silent of human voices forever? 70,000 years ago, long before the first cities rose from the earth, before agriculture transformed wild landscapes into ordered fields, before the written word captured human thoughts for eternity, our ancestors lived in a world that would be almost unrecognizable to us today. They moved in small groups across vast continents, their entire existence dependent on the rhythm of seasons, the migration of animals, and the delicate balance between survival and death that governed every waking moment. But something happened. During those ancient times, something so catastrophic and profound that it nearly erased humanity from existence entirely. The story I'm about to share with you isn't just history, it's the closest our species has ever come to joining the countless others that have vanished into the silence of deep time. If you're settling in for the night, if you're seeking a story that will carry you gently toward sleep while filling your mind with wonder, then stay with me as we journey back to a time when the very survival of human consciousness hung by the most delicate of threads. The world before this great catastrophe was already a harsh and unforgiving place, where early humans had learned to read the language of wind and weather, of animal tracks and seasonal changes, developing an intimate knowledge of their environment that meant the difference between life and death. Yet, even in this challenging world, they had found ways to thrive, to create tools and art, to develop the complex social bonds that would become the foundation of everything we call civilization today. What they could never have imagined was that deep beneath their feet, forces beyond their comprehension were stirring, preparing to unleash an event so powerful that it would plunge the entire planet into darkness and bring our species to the very brink of extinction. This is the story of how close we came to never existing at all, and how the echoes of that ancient catastrophe still whisper through our DNA today, connecting us all in ways we're only beginning to understand. The human beings who lived during this time were not so different from us in their fundamental nature. They felt love and loss, hope and fear, wonder at the beauty of the natural world, and determination to protect their families and communities. They had developed sophisticated languages that allowed them to share complex ideas and emotions, created art that expressed their understanding of the world around them, and built social structures that helped them navigate the challenges of survival in a dangerous and unpredictable environment. These were people who had already demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, having survived previous climate changes, learned to hunt dangerous megafauna with primitive weapons, and successfully migrated across thousands of miles of hostile terrain to establish new communities in unfamiliar landscapes. They had developed technologies that seemed simple by modern standards, but represented tremendous innovations in their time: the controlled use of fire, the creation of sophisticated stone tools, the development of clothing and shelter that could protect them from extreme weather conditions. Their societies were built around principles of cooperation and mutual aid that would prove to be crucial during the dark times ahead. Knowledge was shared freely within communities, with elders passing on their wisdom to younger generations through stories, demonstrations, and patient teaching. Resources were distributed according to need rather than individual accumulation, and decisions that affected the group were made collectively, with input from all members who would be affected by the outcomes. The spiritual lives of these early humans were deeply connected to the natural world around them, recognizing their dependence on forces beyond their control, while also understanding their responsibility to live in harmony with the ecosystems that supported them. They created rituals and ceremonies that reinforced social bonds, honored the memory of those who had died, and expressed gratitude for the resources that sustained their communities through both abundant and difficult times. To truly grasp the magnitude of what was about to unfold, we must first step into the world as it existed before the catastrophe, when early humans had carved out their existence in the wild spaces of Africa and had begun their first tentative migrations into Asia and beyond. Picture, if you will, a planet where the night sky blazed with stars undimmed by the lights of cities, where the sounds of nature calls of animals, the whisper of wind through untouched forests, the gentle lapping of waves on pristine shore, the only soundtrack to human existence. These early people lived in groups rarely numbering more than a few dozen individuals, bound together by kinship, shared knowledge, and the absolute necessity of cooperation for survival. Their days began with the first light of dawn, not because of any artificial schedule, but because daylight meant safety, visibility, and the opportunity to hunt, gather, and travel. They had learned to craft tools from stone and bone with a precision that would impress modern artisans, creating spear points sharp enough to bring down the largest game, scrapers capable of processing hides into warm clothing, and needles fine enough to stitch together garments that could protect them from the harshest weather. Their relationship with the natural world was one of profound intimacy and respect, born from the understanding that they were entirely dependent on the rhythms and resources of their environment. They could read the subtle signs that indicated when fruit would ripen, when animals would migrate. This knowledge wasn't written in books or stored in digital formats, lived in their memories, passed down through generations in stories told around flickering fires, in the patient teaching of elders to the young, in the careful observation of countless small details that meant the difference between abundance and starvation. The climate during this period was already challenging, with ice sheets covering much of northern Europe and North America, creating a world where resources were often scarce and survival required constant adaptation. Yet, within these constraints, early humans had found their rhythm, developing sophisticated strategies for finding food, creating shelter, and maintaining the social bonds that held their small communities together through the long, cold nights and the endless uncertainties of daily existence. They had begun to develop the capacity for abstract thought that would eventually give rise to art, religion, and complex language, evidence of which we can still see today in the cave paintings and carved artifacts they left behind. These weren't just practical people focused solely on survival. They were humans in the fullest sense, capable of wonder, creativity, and the deep emotional connections that make us who we are. The landscapes they inhabited were vastly different from anything we might recognize today, dominated by species that have since gone extinct and shaped by geological processes that operated on timescales far beyond human experience. Massive herds of mammoths migrated across grasslands that stretched to the horizon, while saber-toothed cats and cave bears posed constant threats to human communities that lacked the weapons and fortifications that would later provide greater security. Rivers flowed along courses that have since been altered by millennia of geological change, creating oases of abundance in otherwise harsh environments where human groups could establish temporary camps and exploit the rich resources available in wetland ecosystems. Forests of species that no longer exist provided shelter and resources for both humans and the animals they hunted, creating complex ecological relationships that had developed over millions of years of evolution. The weather patterns of this ancient world were governed by the same fundamental forces that drive climate today, but the specific configurations of continents, ice sheets, and ocean currents created conditions that would seem alien to modern observers. Seasonal variations were often more extreme than those we experience today, with summers that could bring devastating droughts and winters that tested the survival skills of even the most experienced and well-prepared human communities. But as they went about their daily routines, following game trails through ancient forests, gathering roots and berries from familiar landscapes, and settling down each evening to share food and stories around their fires, none of them could have sensed that far to the southeast, in what we now call Indonesia, the earth itself was preparing to convulse in ways that would challenge every survival skill they had ever learned, and threaten the very existence of their species. Deep beneath the tropical paradise of what is now Lake Toba in Sumatra, forces had been building for thousands of years, accumulating pressure in a massive chamber of molten rock that stretched for dozens of miles beneath the Earth's surface. This wasn't an ordinary volcano of the type we might see in textbooks or documentaries. Was what geologists call a supervolcano, a geological monster capable of unleashing destruction on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded human history. To understand the sheer magnitude of what was about to occur, consider that the most powerful volcanic eruption in modern times, Mount Tambora in 1815, ejected roughly 38 cubic miles of material into the atmosphere and caused what became known as the year without a summer across much of the world. The explosion that was building beneath Toba would release nearly 700 cubic miles of material, an amount so vast that it defies easy comprehension, equivalent to emptying a cube of rock and ash 17 miles on each side into the atmosphere in a matter of days, for weeks, perhaps months before the main eruption. The earth in this region would have been restless, shaking with increasingly powerful earthquakes as the magma chamber beneath the surface swelled and cracked the overlying rock. Springs that had run clear for generations might have turned scalding hot or begun to bubble with strange gases. Animals, more sensitive to these subtle changes than humans, would have begun to behave strangely, migrating away from areas they had inhabited for countless generations, their instincts warning them of dangers their conscious minds couldn't comprehend. The local human populations, small groups of early Homo sapiens, who had made their way to these tropical islands in some of humanity's first great maritime adventures would have noticed these changes, but could never have imagined what they portended. They might have created new stories to explain the restless earth, new rituals to appease whatever spirits they believed controlled the forces of nature, never suspecting that they were witnessing the final preparations for an event that would reshape the entire planet. The magma chamber that lay beneath Toba had been filling slowly for tens of thousands of years, fed by the subduction of oceanic plates deep beneath the Indonesian archipelago. As the chamber grew larger and the pressure within it increased, the overlying rock began to bulge upward, creating subtle changes in the landscape that might have been visible to careful observers, but would have seemed insignificant compared to the normal variations in topography that characterize any mountainous region. The chemistry of the magma itself was particularly dangerous, with high concentrations of silica that made it extremely viscous and prone to explosive eruptions when the pressure finally became too great for the overlying rock to contain. Unlike the relatively gentle lava flows that characterize many volcanic eruptions, the material building up beneath Toba was more like a pressure cooker filled with superheated gas and molten rock, waiting for the moment when the lid would finally blow off with catastrophic force. When the eruption finally began, it would have started with a sound unlike anything ever heard, a deep, resonant rumbling that seemed to emerge from the very core of the earth itself, building in intensity until it became a roar that could be heard across entire continents. The initial explosion sent a column of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments more than 20 miles into the atmosphere, so high that it punctured the stratosphere and began to spread across the curve of the Earth itself. The force of this initial blast was equivalent to hundreds of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously, creating shockwaves that traveled around the globe multiple times and generating acoustic effects that could be detected thousands of miles away. Trees were flattened in concentric circles, extending for hundreds of miles from the eruption site, while the heat generated by the explosion was sufficient to ignite fires across vast areas of Southeast Asia. Within hours, pyroclastic avalanches of superheated gas and rock, moving at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, swept across the landscape, obliterating everything in their path and fundamentally altering the geography of Southeast Asia. Islands disappeared beneath layers of volcanic debris. Entire ecosystems were buried under hundreds of feet of ash, and the very shape of the coastline was redrawn by the incredible forces being unleashed from below. The eruption continued for days, possibly weeks, as the massive magma chamber emptied its contents into the atmosphere and across the surrounding landscape. Each successive explosion added more material to the growing cloud of ash and debris that was beginning to spread across the Indian Ocean, carried by the monsoon winds that would normally have brought life-giving rains to the region, but now carried only destruction and darkness. As the eruption continued day after day, the column of ash and debris rising from Toba began to spread outward in all directions, carried by the high-altitude winds that circle our planet in predictable patterns. What had begun as a local catastrophe of unimaginable proportions was about to become a global crisis that would test the survival capabilities of every living thing on Earth. The ash cloud, composed of particles so fine they could remain suspended in the atmosphere for months or even years, began to block increasing amounts of sunlight from reaching the Earth's surface. At first, the effect might have seemed almost beautiful to distant observers. Spectacular sunsets painted in brilliant oranges and reds as sunlight scattered through the particles in the air. But as more and more ash accumulated in the upper atmosphere, the skies began to take on a perpetual twilight quality, with the sun appearing as little more than a dim, pale disk struggling to penetrate the growing veil of volcanic debris. Within weeks, the ash cloud had spread across the entire Indian Ocean, carried by the monsoon winds that normally brought life-giving rains to billions of people. The particles drifted over the Arabian Peninsula, across the vast expanses of Africa, and eventually reached as far as Europe and the Arctic, creating a blanket of volcanic material that encircled the globe and fundamentally altered the planet's energy balance. The immediate effects were catastrophic beyond imagination. Temperatures began to drop as less and less solar energy could penetrate the Ashladon atmosphere, with some estimates suggesting that global temperatures fell by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in the years immediately following the eruption. This might not sound like much, but consider that the difference between our current climate and the depths of the last ice age was only about 6 degrees Celsius. The cooling caused by Toba was enough to plunge the entire planet into a volcanic winter that would last for years. Plants, deprived of the sunlight they needed for photosynthesis, began to wither and die across vast regions of the earth. Forests that had stood for thousands of years turned brown and lifeless. Grasslands that had supported herds of animals became barren wastelands, and the intricate food webs that had evolved over millions of years began to collapse as primary producers could no longer harness the energy they needed to survive. The ash itself was a hazard in ways that extended far beyond its effect on climate. When it mixed with rain, it formed a concrete-like substance that could collapse roofs and bury entire landscapes under layers of hardened debris. The fine particles were dangerous to breathe, causing respiratory problems that could prove fatal, while the chemical composition of the ash could poison water sources and make the soil toxic to plant life for years to come. The psychological impact of living under perpetually dark skies cannot be overstated. Humans, like many other species, have circadian rhythms that are closely tied to the natural cycle of day and night, and the disruption of these patterns would have had profound effects on sleep, mood, and overall health. The constant twilight would have made it difficult to navigate familiar landscapes, to hunt effectively, and to maintain the normal social activities that held communities together. Weather patterns were disrupted on a global scale as the altered energy balance between different regions of the Earth created new wind patterns, changed precipitation cycles, and generally made the climate far less predictable than it had been before the eruption. Regions that had experienced regular rainfall found themselves in the grip of severe droughts, while other areas were inundated with unusual storms and flooding as the atmosphere struggled to adjust to its new thermal regime. The ocean ecosystems were not immune to these changes, as the reduced sunlight penetrating the water column disrupted the photosynthesis of marine phytoplankton that form the base of oceanic food webs. This created cascading effects throughout marine ecosystems, with fish populations crashing and marine mammals struggling to find adequate food sources in waters that had become significantly less productive. Even regions that were geographically distant from the eruption site experienced severe impacts as the ash cloud continued to spread and intensify. Archaeological evidence from sites in India suggests that human populations in that region experienced significant stress during this period, with evidence of abandonment of some settlements and changes in subsistence strategies that indicate severe resource scarcity. The duration of these effects was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the crisis. While human communities might have been able to endure a single bad season or even a few difficult years, the volcanic winter that followed Toba lasted for decades, creating sustained environmental pressure that tested the survival capabilities of human populations across multiple generations. As the volcanic winter tightened its grip on the planet, the small bands of early humans scattered across Africa and Asia found themselves facing a survival crisis, unlike anything our species had ever encountered. These were people who had already proven their resilience by adapting to ice ages, migrating across hostile landscapes, and developing the tools and social structures necessary to thrive in a dangerous world. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for the sustained, global catastrophe that was now unfolding around them. The animals they had traditionally hunted began to disappear as the vegetation they depended on withered and died in the perpetual twilight. Water sources that had been reliable for generations became contaminated with ash or simply dried up as weather patterns shifted and rainfall became increasingly unpredictable. The plant foods that had provided crucial nutrition, especially during lean times, became increasingly scarce as root systems died and fruit trees stopped producing in the cold, dark conditions. Imagine the psychological impact of living through such conditions, waking each morning to skies that never truly brightened, watching familiar landscapes transform into gray, lifeless wastelands, and knowing that each day brought new challenges to finding enough food and water to survive just one more night. The social structures that had held communities together were tested to their limits as resources became scarce and the margin for error in survival decisions essentially disappeared. It's during this period that genetics tells us one of the most haunting stories in human history. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down exclusively through the maternal line, suggests that the effective population of humans during this time may have dropped to as few as 2,000 to 10,000 individuals worldwide. To put this in perspective, there are more people in a single large apartment building in any modern city than comprised the entire breeding population of our species during its closest brush with extinction. This genetic bottleneck, the technical term for when a population's size is severely reduced for an extended period, left permanent marks in our DNA that we can still read today. Every human being currently alive on Earth, all 8 billion of us, can trace our ancestry back to this tiny group of survivors who somehow managed to endure the volcanic winter and pass their genes on to future generations. The survival strategies that emerged during this period would have required unprecedented levels of cooperation, innovation, and adaptation. Small groups might have been forced to combine their resources and knowledge, sharing not just food and shelter, but also the accumulated wisdom of their elders about finding water, creating warmth and identifying any remaining sources of nutrition. In a landscape that had been fundamentally transformed, some populations would have retreated to more favorable microenvironments, perhaps caves that provided shelter from the Ashladon winds, coastal areas where marine resources remained more abundant, or regions where geothermal activity created pockets of relative warmth. Others might have become more nomadic than ever before, constantly moving in search of resources that could sustain them through the long, dark years. The decisions made by these small groups during the crisis would have had profound implications for the future of our species. Groups that hoarded resources and refused to cooperate with neighbors would have been less likely to survive than those that formed larger cooperative networks. Communities that clung too rigidly to traditional ways of doing things would have been at a disadvantage compared to those that could adapt quickly to changing conditions. Innovation became a matter of survival in ways that had never been true before. Traditional hunting techniques might have become ineffective as animal populations crashed and behavior patterns changed. Familiar plant foods might have disappeared entirely, forcing human communities to experiment with previously ignored species or to develop new methods of processing foods that had been considered inedible under normal circumstances. The cultural knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years of human development was both a resource and a potential liability during this period. Traditional ecological knowledge about the behavior of plants and animals, the location of water sources, and the prediction of weather patterns might have become obsolete as ecosystems collapsed and climate patterns shifted dramatically. The psychological stress of living through such conditions would have been enormous, testing not just physical survival capabilities, but also the mental and emotional resilience of individuals and communities. The normal sources of meaning and purpose in human life, the predictable cycles of seasons, the security of familiar environments, the confidence that accumulated knowledge and experience could guide decision-making, were all disrupted by the unprecedented nature of the crisis. Children born during this period would have grown up in a world that bore little resemblance to the one their parents had known, creating intergenerational trauma and forcing communities to completely reimagine their understanding of what normal life could look like. The stories and traditions that had once provided comfort and guidance might have seemed irrelevant or even harmful in the new reality that had emerged from the ash and darkness. The story of humanity's near extinction is written not in stone, tablets, or ancient manuscripts, but in the very DNA that flows through our veins today, carrying within its molecular structure the echoes of that ancient catastrophe and the remarkable story of how our species survived against all odds. Modern genetics has given us the tools to read this microscopic library of our past, revealing details about ancient events that would have otherwise remained forever hidden in the depths of prehistory. Mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material found in the energy-producing organelles of our cells, provides a particularly clear window into our ancient past because it is inherited exclusively through the maternal line, passed from mothers to their children without the genetic recombination that occurs with nuclear DNA. This means that changes in mitochondrial DNA occur only through random mutations that accumulate at a relatively predictable rate over thousands of years, creating what geneticists call a molecular clock that can be used to trace the history of human populations back through time. When scientists first began analyzing the mitochondrial DNA of people from around the world, they discovered something remarkable and disturbing. The genetic diversity of our entire species was far lower than would be expected for a population that had maintained stable numbers over hundreds of thousands of years. Instead, the patterns they observed suggested that at some point in our relatively recent evolutionary past, the human population had been reduced to a very small number of individuals for an extended period of time. This discovery led to what became known as the mitochondrial EV hypothesis, idea that all modern humans can trace their maternal ancestry back to a relatively small group of women who lived in Africa sometime between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. But the timing of this genetic bottleneck, when compared with the geological evidence for the Toba supereruption, suggests that these two events may be intimately connected, with the volcanic catastrophe providing the environmental pressure that reduced our species to the brink of extinction. The genetic evidence reveals other haunting details about this period in our history. The lack of diversity in our mitochondrial DNA suggests that the effective breeding population of humanity, number of individuals who successfully passed their genes on to future generations, may have been reduced to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 people for several thousand years. This represents a genetic bottleneck so severe that it left permanent marks on our species' genetic landscape, creating patterns of DNA variation that persist to this day. Interestingly, this genetic bottleneck appears to have been even more severe in populations that migrated out of Africa, suggesting that the small groups of humans who made the journey into Asia and eventually to other continents represented an even smaller subset of the already diminished African population. This would explain why populations in different parts of the world today show decreasing levels of genetic diversity the further they are from Africa, a pattern that supports the idea that all non-African populations descended from a very small group of migrants who left the continent during or shortly after the period of maximum environmental stress. The Y chromosome, which is passed from fathers to sons, tells a similar story of population reduction during this same time period, though the patterns are somewhat different due to differences in male and female reproductive strategies. The convergence of evidence from multiple genetic systems, all pointing to the same period of population reduction, provides strong support for the hypothesis that humanity experienced a severe bottleneck around the time of the Toba eruption. Modern computational techniques have allowed scientists to model the demographic history of human populations with increasing precision, using sophisticated statistical methods to infer past population sizes from patterns of genetic variation in contemporary populations. These models consistently point to a period of extremely small population size, beginning around 70,000 years ago and lasting for several thousand years, followed by population growth and expansion that eventually led to the colonization of the entire planet. The implications of this genetic bottleneck extend far beyond just the historical curiosity of knowing how close our species came to extinction. The reduced genetic diversity that resulted from this event has had lasting effects on human health and evolution, influencing our susceptibility to certain diseases, our response to environmental challenges, and even our capacity for genetic adaptation to new conditions. Some of the genetic variants that became fixed in human populations during the bottleneck may have been specifically advantageous for survival during the harsh conditions that followed. The Toba eruption, representing evolutionary adaptations to the extreme environmental stress of the volcanic winter. These genetic changes, selected for during humanity's darkest hour, may have contributed to some of the traits that distinguish our species from our closest evolutionary relatives. The study of ancient DNA from archaeological sites has provided additional confirmation of the population bottleneck, with genetic material extracted from fossils and artifacts, showing patterns of variation that are consistent with very small population sizes during the critical period. This archaeological genetic evidence provides independent confirmation of the patterns observed in modern human populations and helps to refine our understanding of exactly when and where the bottleneck occurred. For those who lived through the years immediately following the Toba eruption, the world must have seemed locked in a perpetual state of twilight and cold that stretched on far longer than any normal winter they had ever experienced. Generations were born, lived their entire lives, and died without ever seeing the bright, warm world that their elders might have remembered from before the catastrophe, creating a psychological landscape shaped entirely by scarcity, cold, and the constant struggle for survival. The volcanic winter that followed the eruption lasted not just months or even years, but potentially decades, as the fine ash particles suspended in the upper atmosphere continued to block significant amounts of solar radiation from reaching the Earth's surface. During this time, global temperatures remained depressed, growing seasons were shortened or eliminated entirely in many regions, and the normal patterns of weather and climate that life on Earth depended upon were fundamentally disrupted. Imagine what it must have been like to be a child growing up during this period, learning about the world from parents and grandparents who could remember warmth and abundance, but whose own experience was limited to a landscape of gray skies, sparse vegetation, and the constant uncertainty about whether enough food could be found to survive another day. These children would have developed survival skills that were even more refined and desperate than those of their ancestors, learning to extract nutrition from sources that previous generations might never have considered, to find shelter in the most marginal environments, and to cooperate in ways that maximized the survival chances of their small groups. The psychological impact of living through such conditions would have been profound and lasting, creating cultural patterns and survival instincts that might have persisted for thousands of years after the immediate crisis had passed. Stories told around the few fires that could be maintained in such harsh conditions would have emphasized themes of endurance, cooperation, and the importance of sharing resources, even when those resources were desperately scarce. During this period, human innovation may have accelerated out of sheer necessity, as traditional survival strategies proved inadequate for the changed conditions. New methods of food procurement, storage, and preparation would have been essential, along with improved techniques for creating and maintaining shelter, clothing, and tools in an environment where resources were extremely limited and the margin for error was essentially non-existent. The social bonds that held communities together during this time would have been tested and strengthened, in ways that left permanent marks on human culture and psychology. The ability to share resources, even when doing so meant personal sacrifice. To maintain cooperation, even under extreme stress, and to preserve hope and cultural knowledge, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds, would have become defining characteristics of the groups that survived. Language itself may have evolved during this period, developing new vocabulary and concepts to describe the unprecedented conditions that humans were experiencing. Words for different types of cold, for various degrees of hunger, for the subtle signs that might indicate the location of scarce resources, would have become part of everyday speech. While older terms related to abundance and predictable seasonal cycles might have taken on mythical or historical connotations, the religious and spiritual practices of human communities would have been profoundly affected by the long winter, as traditional beliefs about the nature of the world and the relationship between humans and the natural environment were challenged by the unprecedented nature of the crisis. New rituals and ceremonies might have emerged to help communities cope with the psychological stress of the situation, while older practices might have been abandoned or transformed in response to the changed circumstances. Art and music, despite the desperate conditions, likely continued to play important roles in maintaining community cohesion and providing emotional outlets for the stress and trauma of daily survival. The cave paintings and carved artifacts that have survived from this period suggest that even during the darkest times in human history, our ancestors maintained their capacity for creative expression and symbolic thinking. The concept of time itself might have been affected by the long winter, as the normal markers of seasonal change that had traditionally helped humans organize their activities and plan for the future became unreliable or disappeared entirely. The ability to maintain long-term thinking and planning in the absence of the familiar rhythms of nature would have been crucial for survival, but also psychologically challenging for communities whose entire worldview had been organized around predictable natural cycles, trade and exchange networks between different human groups. If they continued to exist at all during this period, would have taken on even greater importance as communities shared information about survival strategies, resource locations, and environmental conditions across vast distances. The maintenance of these social connections, despite the enormous challenges of travel and communication in such harsh conditions, would have been essential for the long-term survival of the species. The memory of the time before the catastrophe would have become increasingly precious and potentially mythologized as the long winter continued, with elders who could remember the warm, bright world playing crucial roles as keepers of cultural knowledge about how life had once been and might someday be again. These oral traditions would have served not just as historical records, but as sources of hope and inspiration for communities struggling to maintain their humanity in the face of seemingly endless hardship, survival against the odds. What made the difference between the human populations that survived the volcanic winter and those that disappeared forever into the silence of extinction? The answer lies not just in luck or geographical advantages, but in the unique combination of traits that our species had developed over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, traits that proved to be exactly what was needed to endure the most severe environmental challenge our planet had faced in millions of years. Perhaps most Important was the human capacity for cooperation on a scale that went far beyond simple family groups. While other species might retreat into individual survival mode during times of extreme scarcity, humans appear to have done the opposite, forming larger cooperative networks that allowed them to share resources, knowledge, and labor in ways that maximized everyone's chances of survival. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests that trade networks and cultural exchange continued even during the worst of the volcanic winter, indicating that human communities maintained contact and cooperation across vast distances. Despite the enormous challenges they faced, the human capacity for innovation and adaptation also proved crucial during this period. Unlike other species that were locked into specific ecological niches, humans demonstrated a remarkable ability to modify their behavior, diet, and survival strategies in response to changing conditions. They learned to exploit new food sources, develop new hunting and gathering techniques, and create new forms of shelter and clothing, adapted to the harsh conditions of the volcanic winter. Language and cultural transmission played vital roles in survival as well. The ability to share detailed information about local conditions, successful survival strategies, and the location of resources across large geographical areas meant that innovations and discoveries made by one group could potentially benefit many others. Stories, songs, and oral traditions helped preserve crucial survival knowledge and maintain social cohesion even when communities were scattered across hostile landscapes. The flexibility of human social organization also proved to be a significant advantage. Unlike many other species with rigid social structures, humans could adapt their group dynamics to changing circumstances, combining smaller bands into larger cooperative units when resources were available, or splitting into smaller, more mobile groups when conditions required it. This social flexibility allowed human populations to optimize their survival strategies in response to local conditions, while maintaining the broader networks that provided security and shared knowledge. Perhaps most remarkably, the humans who survived this period managed to preserve not just their lives, but also the cultural and technological knowledge that would become the foundation for everything that followed. Cave paintings, carved tools, and other artifacts from this era show that even during the darkest period in human history, our ancestors continued to create art, develop new technologies, and maintain the complex symbolic thinking that distinguishes our species from all others. The ability to think abstractly and plan for the future, even when the immediate present was dominated by survival concerns, may have been one of the most important factors that distinguished successful human groups from those that did not survive. Communities that could maintain long-term thinking, preserve important knowledge for future generations, and continue to invest in activities that would pay off only after the immediate crisis had passed, would have been more likely to emerge successfully from the bottleneck. Geographic factors also played important roles in determining which populations survived. Groups that had access to relatively stable food sources such as coastal areas where marine resources remained available, or regions with geothermal activity that provided warmth and prevented complete ecosystem collapse, would have had significant advantages over those in areas where the environmental effects of the eruption were more severe. The timing of the bottleneck may have been crucial as well. Human populations that had recently developed new technologies or social innovations that proved advantageous during the crisis would have been more likely to survive than those that were still relying on older, less flexible survival strategies. The accumulated technological and cultural knowledge of successful groups would have been passed on to their descendants, creating a foundation for future growth and expansion. The genetic makeup of surviving populations may have included variants that provided specific advantages during the extreme conditions of the volcanic winter. Individuals with genetic traits that improved their ability to metabolize limited food sources, maintain body temperature in cold conditions, or resist the health effects of breathing ash-laden air would have been more likely to survive and reproduce, passing these advantageous traits on to future generations. The social and psychological traits that helped communities maintain cohesion during the crisis, as the ability to maintain hope in desperate circumstances, to resolve conflicts peacefully when resources were scarce, and to make collective decisions that prioritized group survival over individual advantage would have been as important as any physical or technological adaptations in determining which populations successfully navigated the bottleneck. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the Earth began to heal from the wounds inflicted by the Great Eruption. The fine particles of ash that had shrouded the planet for so long finally began to settle out of the atmosphere, allowing increasing amounts of sunlight to penetrate to the surface and begin the slow process of environmental recovery. The change would have been so gradual that individual humans might not have noticed it from day to day. But over months and years, the world slowly began to brighten and warm as the natural cycles of weather and climate reasserted themselves. The first signs of recovery would have appeared in the plant life, as seeds that had remained dormant in the soil during the long winter began to sprout in response to the returning light and warmth. Grasses would have been among the first to return, followed by shrubs and eventually trees, beginning the long process of ecological succession that would gradually restore the complex ecosystems that had been devastated by the eruption. As vegetation returned, so too did the animals that depended on it, starting with small creatures like insects and rodents, then expanding to include the larger herbivores and eventually the predators that formed the top of the food chain for the small populations of humans who had somehow managed to survive the catastrophe. This gradual environmental recovery represented the difference between continued existence at the very edge of survival and the possibility of actually beginning to thrive once again. As food sources became more abundant and reliable, human populations would have begun to grow slowly, spreading out from the refugia where they had weathered the worst of the volcanic winter to recolonize areas that had been uninhabitable for decades. But the humans who emerged from this bottleneck were not the same as those who had entered it. The experience of surviving such extreme conditions had left its mark not just on their genes, but on their culture, their psychology, and their relationship with the natural world. They carried with them hard-won knowledge about survival in the most marginal environments, about the importance of cooperation and resource sharing, and about the fragility of the systems that support life on Earth. That the genetic diversity that had been lost during the bottleneck could never be fully recovered. The unique genetic lineages that had disappeared during the volcanic winter were gone forever, leaving all future humans descended from the relatively small pool of survivors who had managed to endure the catastrophe. This loss of genetic diversity had both positive and negative implications for our species, creating a more genetically uniform humanity that shared certain survival advantages but also potentially increased susceptibility to certain diseases and environmental challenges. As human populations began to expand again, they carried with them the cultural innovations and survival strategies that had proven successful during the darkest period in our species' history. The emphasis on cooperation, the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions, and the capacity for innovation under pressure became defining characteristics of human culture that would shape our development for thousands of years to come. The expansion that followed the end of the volcanic winter was not simply a return to pre-catastrophe conditions, but represented the beginning of a new phase in human development, characterized by greater technological sophistication, more complex social organization, and an increased capacity for long-distance migration and colonization of new environments. The populations that emerged from the bottleneck possessed not only the genetic and cultural heritage of the survivors, but also the collective memory of having overcome seemingly impossible odds through cooperation and innovation. Archaeological evidence from sites around the world shows that the period following the end of the volcanic winter was marked by significant technological and cultural innovations, including the development of more sophisticated tools, the creation of more complex art and symbolic expression, and the establishment of trade networks that spanned vast distances. These developments suggest that the experience of surviving the catastrophe had not only preserved human populations, but had also accelerated their cultural and technological development. The migration patterns that emerged during this period of recovery and expansion would eventually lead to the colonization of Australia, Europe, and eventually the Americas. As human populations that had been confined to small refugia during the volcanic winter began to spread out across the globe in search of new resources and opportunities. The genetic signatures of these migrations can still be traced in modern populations, providing a detailed map of how humanity recovered from its closest brush with extinction. The psychological and cultural effects of the bottleneck experience would have persisted for many generations after the immediate environmental crisis had passed. Stories and traditions commemorating the dark time and celebrating the ancestors who had survived it would have become central elements of human culture, providing both historical memory and moral guidance for future generations facing their own challenges and uncertainties. The relationship between humans and the natural environment that emerged from this experience was likely characterized by a deep awareness of environmental fragility and the importance of living in harmony with natural systems. Having witnessed the collapse of familiar ecosystems and the near extinction of their own species, the survivors would have developed cultural practices and belief systems that emphasized sustainability, conservation, and respect for the natural forces that ultimately controlled their survival. Every time you look in a mirror, every time you see another human face on the street or in a photograph, you are looking at the descendant of someone who survived the closest call our species has ever had with complete extinction. The genetic material that determines the color of your eyes, the texture of your hair, the shape of your face, and countless other characteristics can be traced back through an unbroken chain of survival to that small population of humans who somehow managed to endure the volcanic winter that followed the Toba eruption. This realization carries with it a profound sense of connection to both the past and to every other human being alive today. Despite all the apparent differences between people from different cultures, different continents, and different walks of life, we are all part of an incredibly close-knit family when viewed from the perspective of evolutionary time. The genetic studies that revealed the human bottleneck also showed that the genetic differences between any two humans, no matter how different they might appear, are smaller than the differences that exist within most other species. The mitochondrial DNA that flows through your cells today carries within its molecular structure the signature of that ancient catastrophe and the remarkable story of survival that followed. The patterns of genetic variation that scientists can read in your DNA tell the story of small populations struggling to survive in harsh conditions, of mothers passing their genetic heritage on to their children through countless generations, of hardship and gradual recovery of a species that came perilously close to joining the vast majority of all species that have ever lived in the silence of extinction. But the echoes of that ancient extinction extend beyond just our genetic heritage. The psychological and cultural traits that helped our ancestors survive the volcanic winter, that capacity for cooperation, the ability to innovate under pressure, the tendency to form strong social bonds, even with unrelated individuals, and the drive to preserve and transmit knowledge across generations remain defining characteristics of human nature today. When you see people coming together to help strangers during natural disasters, when you witness the remarkable innovations that emerge in response to global challenges, when you observe the deep human need to create art and preserve stories, even in the most difficult circumstances, you are seeing the expression of traits that were forged in the crucible of our species' closest brush with extinction. The story written in our genes is ultimately one of resilience and hope, demonstrating that even when faced with seemingly impossible odds, life finds a way to persist and eventually to flourish. Every human achievement since that time, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every act of compassion, every moment of joy exists because a small group of our ancestors refused to give up during the darkest period in our species' history. The genetic bottleneck that nearly ended human existence also created the foundation for all future human diversity and achievement. The small population of survivors carried within their genes the potential for all the variations in human appearance, ability, and temperament that we see in the world today. Every language that has ever been spoken, every song that has ever been sung, every story that has ever been told can trace its ultimate origins back to the cultural knowledge preserved by those ancient survivors. Modern research in genetics continues to reveal new details about our shared ancestry and the remarkable journey that brought us from the edge of extinction to our current status as a global species with nearly 8 billion members. Techniques for analyzing ancient DNA, computational methods for modeling population history, and new discoveries about the relationship between genetics and culture are all contributing to a more complete understanding of how that small group of survivors became the ancestors of all modern humanity. The implications of our shared genetic heritage extend far beyond just scientific curiosity, influencing how we think about human rights, social justice, and our responsibilities to one another and to the planet we share. The knowledge that we are all descendants of the same small group of survivors who overcame seemingly impossible odds through cooperation and mutual aid provides a powerful argument for the fundamental unity of the human species despite all our surface-level differences. The genetic markers of the ancient bottleneck also serve as a reminder of our species' vulnerability and the importance of preserving the genetic, cultural, and environmental diversity that has accumulated over the tens of thousands of years since our ancestors emerged from their darkest hour. The knowledge that our species has survived near extinction once provides both hope for our resilience and sobering awareness of how close we can come to losing everything that makes us human. Pause for a moment and try to imagine an Earth where the human experiment had ended 70,000 years ago, where the small bands of survivors scattered across Africa and Asia had not quite managed to endure the long volcanic winter, where the thread of human consciousness had finally snapped after hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary development. What would our planet look like today if the last human voices had fallen silent during those dark decades following the Toba eruption? The forests and grasslands would have continued their cycles of growth and change, unmarked by human intervention, following patterns established over millions of years of evolution. The great migrations of animals would have continued across continents that knew no borders, no cities, no roads to interrupt their ancient pathways. Rivers would have flowed unaltered from their sources to the sea, carrying only the sediments and nutrients that had sustained aquatic ecosystems since long before humans first learned to make tools from stone and bone. There would be no art galleries filled with paintings that capture the human experience of beauty and suffering. No libraries containing the accumulated wisdom and stories of countless generations. No music to give voice to the emotions that make consciousness more than just survival. The cave paintings left by our ancestors would have slowly faded and crumbled, their messages of human creativity and symbolic thinking eventually erased by the patient work of geological time. The night sky would still blaze with the same stars that inspired wonder in our ancestors, but there would be no human eyes to see them, no human minds to create myths and stories about the patterns of constellations, no telescopes to reveal the vast cosmic structures that surround us, the secrets of the universe, the nature of matter and energy, the history of galaxies. The possibility of life on other worlds would remain forever locked away, known only to whatever alien intelligences might exist in the vast darkness of space. Perhaps most poignantly, there would be no language to give names to the beauty that would continue to exist on Earth. No words to describe the way sunlight filters through forest canopies. No poetry to capture the sound of waves on distant shores. No stories to preserve the memory of remarkable events or extraordinary individuals. The capacity for abstract thought, for moral reasoning, for the creation of meaning from experience would have vanished from our planet, leaving behind a world that was still complex and beautiful, but forever silent of the consciousness that could appreciate and understand that beauty. The absence of humanity would have meant the absence of music, that can move listeners to tears, of mathematical equations that reveal the hidden order underlying natural phenomena, of philosophical questions about the nature of existence and consciousness. There would be no scientific discoveries to expand our understanding of life and the universe. No technological innovations to extend human capabilities. No ethical systems to guide behavior toward justice and compassion without human intervention. The climate of Earth would have continued to evolve according to natural cycles, with ice ages coming and going according to the predictable rhythms of orbital mechanics and solar variation. Species would have continued to evolve and go extinct according to the random processes of natural selection, with no conscious intelligence to document their existence or mourn their passing. The geological processes that shape our planet would have continued unchanged, with volcanoes erupting, mountains rising and falling, and continents drifting across the surface of the globe according to the same physical laws that have governed these processes for billions of years. But there would be no human minds to study these processes, to understand their underlying mechanisms, or to predict their future effects. The absence of human consciousness would have meant the absence of hope, of the capacity to envision better futures and work toward their realization. There would be no dreams of exploration and discovery, no aspirations toward justice and equality, no efforts to reduce suffering and increase happiness for all sentient beings. The moral dimension of existence, the ability to distinguish between right and wrong, to feel empathy for others, to take responsibility for the consequences of one's actions, would have vanished entirely from our corner of the universe. Perhaps, most tragically, there would be no memory of what had been lost, no awareness of the remarkable experiment in consciousness that had briefly flickered into existence and then been extinguished by the forces of nature. The universe would have continued its expansion and evolution, indifferent to the disappearance of the only known example of intelligence and creativity that had emerged from billions of years of cosmic development. As we return from our journey into the deep past and our contemplation of alternate histories, we find ourselves once again in the present moment, inheritors of an unbroken chain of survival that stretches back through that ancient bottleneck to the very origins of our species. The story of humanity's near extinction 70,000 years ago serves not just as a fascinating glimpse into our prehistoric past, but as a sobering reminder of how precarious our existence on this planet truly is, even today when we command technologies that would seem like magic to our ancient ancestors. The threats that face humanity in the 21st century are both similar to and different from the volcanic catastrophe that nearly ended our story before it had truly begun. Climate change driven by human activity is altering the fundamental systems that support life on Earth, potentially triggering environmental changes as dramatic as those that followed the Toba eruption, but this time caused by our own actions, rather than geological forces beyond our control. Nuclear weapons possess the capability to create destruction on a scale that could rival or exceed the Toba supereruption, with the added element of human choice in whether and how such devastating power might be unleashed. The interconnected nature of our modern global civilization means that disruptions to critical systems, whether caused by natural disasters, technological failures, or human conflict, could have cascading effects that reach every corner of the earth within days or weeks. Pandemic diseases, as we have recently been reminded, retain the potential to spread rapidly through human populations that are now more connected than ever before in our species' history. While our medical knowledge and technological capabilities are vastly superior to those available to our ancient ancestors, the sheer density and mobility of modern human populations create new vulnerabilities that could potentially threaten our survival in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies present both unprecedented opportunities and potential risks that our species has never had to navigate before. The same capacity for innovation and adaptation that helped our ancestors survive the volcanic winter will be crucial for managing these new challenges. But the speed and scale of technological change in the modern world may test our ability to respond wisely to rapidly evolving circumstances. Environmental degradation on a global scale, including deforestation, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, and pollution, is altering the Earth's ecosystems in ways that could potentially trigger cascading effects similar to those that followed the Toba eruption. The difference is that this time we are the cause of the environmental changes. Yet the same traits that enabled our ancestors to survive the volcanic winter, our capacity for cooperation, innovation, and adaptation, remain part of our species' toolkit for facing whatever challenges the future might bring. The knowledge we have gained about our own history, including the story of how close we came to extinction in the past, provides valuable perspective on both our vulnerabilities and our remarkable resilience as a species. The global communication networks that connect modern human populations also create unprecedented opportunities for the kind of large-scale cooperation that may be necessary to address challenges that affect our entire species. The same internet that can spread misinformation and division can also facilitate the sharing of scientific knowledge, the coordination of international responses to global threats, and the preservation of human culture and knowledge in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Modern science has given us tools for understanding and predicting natural phenomena that far exceed anything available to our ancestors, providing early warning systems for natural disasters, sophisticated models for predicting climate change, and detailed knowledge about the conditions that support life on Earth. This knowledge creates both opportunities and responsibilities that previous generations never had to face. The question that echoes across the 70,000 years since our ancestors faced their greatest challenge is whether we have learned to recognize and respect the fragility of our existence, or whether we still walk too close to the edge of catastrophe, confident in our technologies and institutions, but perhaps underestimating the forces that could still threaten our survival. The story of the Toba bottleneck reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, that the thread of consciousness that connects us to our ancestors and to future generations is more fragile than we might like to believe, and that the choices we make today may determine whether our species continues its remarkable journey or joins the countless others that have vanished into the silence of deep time. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider this: we are all part of an extraordinary story of survival against impossible odds. But that story is still being written, and its ending remains unknown. The same capacity for hope, cooperation, and innovation that carried our ancestors through their darkest hour remains available to us as we face our own challenges and uncertainties, reminding us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the human spirit has proven itself capable of finding ways to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to thrive.